All right, everybody, welcome to the channel. I am Brian Lee Durfee, author of The Forgetting Moon, The Blackest Heart, and The Lonesome Crown, all published by Simon & Schuster's Saga Press. Today, we're going to be doing a video about why fantasy fans and fantasy readers should all be reading non-fiction books. That's right, I've got my entire non-fiction library right here. We're going to be talking about nonfiction and why you all should be reading it. So let's go and let's just show you a little bit of a tour of it. I mean, up here we got World War II books. We got religious books. We got more religious books. We've got science books and all sorts of research books. More science books and research books down here. We've got our, we got our Robert Jordan collection right there. But we've got some books on whaling, slave ships, the Battle of Trafalgar. Got English history books down here. All of my books about my favorite Oakland Raiders players. All of my creative writing books, how to write novels books. All of my rock and roll stars books. Biographies of U.S. presidents and history. Man, it's all right here, folks. This is where the research is done for writing. You know, we've got our series. Let me see if that's set up right. Yeah, we've got our series of books. We've got our series of videos. The first one was, why should fantasy fans and readers and writers read mystery novels? Why should they read horror novels? Why should they read? I mean, we're doing a whole series on this, and now we're to non-fiction. I think what my most popular one was, why should fantasy fans and writers read Westerns? I want this nonfiction one to be the most popular because we're going to be talking about how to research things for your novels. These videos are predominantly writing advice videos. Now, if you're a fantasy fan and you just want to broaden your reading horizons, this is also a video for you, but this is mostly for fantasy writers. This is mostly a writing advice video. So let's get to it. One of the reasons we want to, as writers, one of the reasons we want to read nonfiction is because fiction is oftentimes stranger than the truth. No, that's not the way it goes. The truth is oftentimes stranger than fiction. Right off the bat, man, let's just talk about one of my favorite books of all time, The Dirt by Motley Crue. If you were to write a novel about a rock band and you were to put the things in it that is in the dirt, people would be like, that is implausible. There's no way four guys could be that crazy and that irresponsible and that dangerous to society and make it as a rock band. But they do. That's why you got to read rock biographies. You got to read about the crazy crap that people do in their lives if you want to have interesting stories. Because the crazier the people are in your stories, the more interesting. And let me give you some examples. Just about, let's talk about... So I work at the Utah State Prison, right? I teach creative writing. I teach life skills to the inmates. And I'm telling you, that prison is full of people that have done things in their lives that if you were to put it in a book, you wouldn't believe it. You'd be like, there's no way. That's implausible. That can't happen. People don't behave like that. People would never make those kind of decisions. And if you're writing mysteries, if you're writing horror, if you're writing fantasy, it doesn't matter. You got to put the craziest stuff in your stories, and you got to expect the reader to believe it. You can't let people or book reviewers and say, no, that's implausible. Nobody would ever act that way because the prisons are full of people that have acted that way. Every story, every murder, every kidnapping, everything that happens that puts people in prison is because they did something just that nobody, oh my gosh. Just think about it. Elizabeth Smart. Elizabeth Smart, if you remember that, her kidnapping, she was a young girl from Salt Lake, got kidnapped. When they finally found her a year later, she was wearing a veil. The FBI had been searching everywhere for her, and she was right in plain sight. That guy kidnapped her, put her in a veil, and trotted her through downtown Salt Lake City, through homeless shelters, through frat parties. She attended frat parties. She went to the library. She went to the public library, hidden in a veil. Everybody in the United States was searching for this person. She was hidden in plain sight. If you were to put that in a book, people would be like, I don't believe it. That's an implausible story. All the Goodreads reviewers would be, that's too outlandish, that would never happen. But it did happen. And you gotta read these kind of things so you know the type of crazy that humans are. The Stranger Beside Me, about Ted Bundy murders. Serial killers. Silence of the Lambs was popular because it was so outlandish, nobody could believe that would happen. You've got to read these type of true crime nonfiction stories if you want to get your stories to be on the level that it takes. Biographies. We want to read biographies. We want to read presidential biographies. We want to read presidential biographies like by Ronald Reagan. We want to read presidential biographies, like Barack Obama. Strongly conservative, strongly liberal. You want to have both sides. You want to be well-rounded in how every single person thinks. Because if you're just a liberal and you're just writing stuff from a liberal perspective, nobody's going to be interested in that. Nobody's going to be interested in your woke bullshit unless you can contrast it with realistic views of the Republicans, the conservatives, the other people, and vice versa. If you're a strict conservative and you hate the woke thing, you've got to understand how woke works. You've got to understand how those people think. You've got to be well-rounded in all of it. The same with religion. Not only do you got to understand how people like Richard Dawkins, the atheist, thinks, not only do you need to understand why God is a delusion, but you've also got to read all of these Christian books that I've got. Books on Mormonism. I've got books on Mormonism. I've got books on Jesus. I read the Bible. I read the Quran. I read the Book of Mormon. I want to understand all of it. So when I put religion into my stories, it makes sense. That's why nonfiction is important. You've got to understand how atheists think. You've got to understand how Christians think. And you've got to understand how Muslims think, Jewish people. You've got to understand all of that. Because if you're going to be writing about this stuff, you need to be well-rounded and grounded in all of it. You need to understand everything. When wars break out, when there are wars, you need to understand the rise and fall of the Third Reich. You got to understand how communism came about. You got to understand socialism. You got to understand capitalism. You've got to have a grasp of all the types of economic situations there are in this world. You've got to understand how Adolf Hitler came to power. You've got to understand what it takes to get evil people to do evil things, whether it's through religion, whether it's through socialism, whether it's through capitalism. All of the above. You got to get into it and you got to read these things. And you saw my bookshelf. I got all of it. I've read all of it. And then once wars start, you've got to understand how they're fought. Whether it's World War II, whether it's, the Battle of Trafalgar, whether it's medieval battles, you've got to get into that. You got to read these type of books to understand how, especially if you're an epic fantasy writer, you need to understand how these things happen, how they're fought, how machine guns work, how swords work, how sword fighting work, how, let's say you've got a big fantasy battle coming up in your book, and you want to know what kind of horses do knights ride? What kind of war horses do they ride? Do they ride different horses to the battle that they fight within the battle? There's war chargers, there's palfreys. You got to know the difference between the two and what they're used for. You got to know what a draft horse is used for. You got to know what kind of horses are used on the farms as opposed to what kind of horses are used in the battles. It's all important. All of it is important. And the more the stuff you research, the more books you have in the nonfiction, the better you're going to be. Especially, let's talk about history. Let's talk about ancient history. I mean, if you're writing fantasy, you're going to want to understand medieval history as it pertains to places like London, Paris, France, Germany. Let's say you don't want to have a Eurocentric fantasy. Let's say you want to set your fantasy in India, or maybe Australia, or maybe New Zealand, maybe Taiwan, maybe Africa, maybe China. It doesn't matter, but you've got to research all of these things, and you've got to have books on hand written by people that know what they're talking about so you can get it correct. If you want to write stuff about revolutions, figure out how people felt in 1776. I don't care if your fantasy book is set in medieval wherever. If there's a revolution, you need to understand what kind of thoughts, what kind of people, what kind of things start revolutions. That continue the revolution when things look bad. Why do people keep fighting? Read books like 1776 so you know what motivates warriors, what motivates people to keep fighting for their freedoms. You got to know that. You got to read this stuff. You can't just read a few fantasy books and think that, oh, well, I've read those. I know what I'm talking about. Because no, what makes great fantasy is people like Robert Jordan, who fought in Vietnam, who knows about war, who can write The Wheel of Time based off of his experiences in those situations. I mean, nonfiction is where you do all of it. You know, let's talk about Guns, Germs, and Steel. Let's say you're writing fantasy, let's say you're writing science fiction and you want to understand how world building, I mean, Guns, Germs, and Steel is world building. It's world building. You understand how people migrate from place to place. You understand how different societies, through different economic systems, build up their societies, whether it's through capitalism or this or that or the other. You understand it because Guns, Germs, and Steels and a ton of other scientific books that I had back here show you exactly how to do that. So you can construct in your fantasy world an economic system, a religious system, because we talked about religion, a feudal system, because you can understand how evil people become evil. You can get yourself a dark lord that's worse than these. I mean, you see where I'm going with this. You got to read it now. If you're not a writer, and you just want to read great books to learn and educate yourself, nonfiction, man. Go get all the presidential biographies. Go get all the science books that you can. Go get all the history books about World War II. Read all the battle books about World War II. Read every book. If you're into heavy metal, read Paul Stanley's biography, Gene Simmons' biography, Ace Frehley's biography, Peter Criss. Read all the Kiss. Read everything. Read Bruce Springsteen. Read Elton John. Read everything that's written. I mean, basically, the philosophy of my channel is we don't just buy books. We buy all the books. We buy all the books. That's right. We get them all. This is my nonfiction library, folks. This is the nonfiction. Look at that. That's only a tenth of my library. My nonfiction is only a tenth of the library. My nonfiction should probably be 50% of my library. But you know, if you've seen my library that I've got upstairs, we got a ton of stuff up there. People, let's start reading. Let's read more than just fantasy books. That's why I review everything on my channel. I don't just review even though I'm an epic fantasy writer. Even though these books I've written here are epic fantasy. Even though I collect swords and I collect pictures. Well, that's a picture of this. Hey, even though I'm into epic fantasy and that's what I write and that's what I'm known for, on my BookTube channel, we're going to be reviewing, and we have been for the last year, we've been reviewing everything. Everything from westerns to mysteries to thrillers to historical fiction to nonfiction. Man, we're going to even get into some romance. Romance, and why that's important to read. Why things like Twilight are important for you to read and understand. We do it all, folks. We do it all here. We don't just buy books. We buy all the books!